Ah, Julian Rivers, 31 years old, and the truth, wrung out until the last drop of blood, solidified into a bitter lump in my throat. You can give yourself entirely, dissolve into someone, into a whole family, and still remain a stranger at your own table. I naively believed marriage was a sacrifice, a relentless presence, even when a void yawned inside. It turned out love wasn't about bleeding for those who wouldn't offer even a meager bandage. Talia, my wife, the very embodiment of refinement. She came from a lineage whose centuries-old portraits above stone fireplaces and surnames opened doors to country clubs. Her father, Gerald Byrne, never harbored any affection for me. I wasn't their kind, a boy who grew up in a provincial town garage, clawing his way through studies, inheriting no estates, no titles, only debts. He saw rust where he expected gold. But Talia, she chose me. Or at least, I thought she did. Monica, her younger sister, received everything on a silver platter. Credit cards without limits, internships leading to positions she hadn't earned. She was adored, admired, elevated to such a pedestal that gravity itself seemed to turn away when she decided to pursue law. And then I, silently, stepped forward, paid for her tuition when Gerald's trust fund unexpectedly dried up. Not once, not for a single semester, did I expect gratitude. I simply believed we were a team, a family. 2 years ago, during a storm, Gerald's roof collapsed. Talia sobbed into the phone, begging for help. The next day, I sent workers, paid the bill even before the first tile was removed. And then there was Talia's boutique, her long-held dream. I watched her sketch designs on napkins, daydreaming between business meetings. My bonus, set aside for our future, went to purchasing inventory, paying for the domain name, the first 6 months of rent. I built the website myself, between investor calls and my own deadlines. Every time I saw her proudly packing orders, I convinced myself it was worth it. After all, love is about giving, supporting, putting the team before yourself, isn't it? But everything changed that evening at dinner. We sat at their long oak table, where every meal felt more like an examination than a family gathering. Monica had just returned from her law school trip to Aspen. Gerald sipped his scotch, his cufflinks catching the candlelight. Talia glowed with that timeless beauty that always enveloped her in her family's presence, aloof, polished to a sheen, agonizingly perfect. I don't even remember what triggered the outburst. Perhaps I dared to suggest a different approach to the estate's renovation budget. Perhaps I refused yet another loan. But suddenly, Gerald slammed his hand on the table, looked me straight in the eye, and said in an icy tone, "You only take. You've never given anything to this family." The room plunged into a ringing silence. The scotch burned my throat, but not as much as those words. I glanced at Talia. Her lips were pressed tightly together, her gaze steady, but then she gave a barely perceptible nod. Once, like a sentence passed. "If you have even a drop of pride left, Julian," Gerald hissed, his voice low and final, "you'll leave." I waited for someone to intercede, for Monica to say, "That's unfair," for Talia to reach out, even under the table. But nothing happened. I felt like a stranger in my own life, as if I'd walked into a play mid-act and forgotten my lines. I wasn't angry, I wasn't even heartbroken, I was empty. That chilling emptiness you only feel when the people you considered your world show you how insignificant your role was in theirs. And I did the only thing I could do. I stood up, without a shout, without slamming a door, without a last desperate plea for dignity. I left my plate half full, my wine untouched, my chair slightly pushed back. I went upstairs, packed the bare essentials into a small duffel bag, and came back down to a room full of eyes that didn't follow me. No one moved, not even her. I didn't say goodbye, because you only say goodbye to those who care about your absence. As the door clicked shut softly behind me, I realized something profound. I had never truly belonged in that house. I had been a guest in my own marriage, and I had finally checked out. I didn't yell, didn't throw things. There was no melodramatic exit, no grandiose speech about what I had done, what I had given. Such a performance would only have fueled their narrative. Julian, the unstable outsider, had finally snapped. Instead, I went silent. The silence that comes after years of talking into an emotional void and receiving only passive nods in return. That night, I drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, parked in the gravel lot, climbed the stairs with my single duffel bag, and lay on a bed that smelled of bleach and old television remotes. I stared at the ceiling until the sun rose. Then I opened my laptop and sent 5 emails, each one short, clear, surgically precise. The first was to my accountant. Halt all regular payments associated with the Byrne household immediately. The second was to my lawyer, Victor. We needed to review all joint financial obligations, quietly, strategically. The third was to the leasing company that provided Gerald's car. I had signed the guarantee out of goodwill for the family. That goodwill had expired. The fourth was to Monica's university's financial department. I had been paying her tuition directly from my account. I informed them that I was no longer responsible for future payments and was canceling all linked cards. And finally, a short internal memo to my team. Working remotely for the next few months, relocating from Los Angeles to Seattle, all correspondence to remain the same. That was it. No speeches, no explanations, just absence. I didn't block anyone, didn't make any announcements. I simply disappeared. I thought, maybe someone would notice. Maybe Talia would text or Monica would call. Even Gerald, despite his disdain, might send a curt message asking where the next check was. But nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks. Silence. It's funny how people stop calling when the money runs out. Not to ask if you're okay, not to check on you. Just silence. And in that silence, I began to breathe. I found a small attic apartment in Seattle, hardwood floors, a single window with a view of the harbor if you craned your neck. Nothing fancy, nothing designed for anyone but me. I furnished it with secondhand pieces, an old leather couch with a scratch on the armrest, a bookshelf that leaned slightly to the left, a kettle that whistled a little too loudly. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I stopped living as if I owed someone something. 2 months later, my phone rang. It was Monica. Her name flashed on the screen like a ghost. I'd forgotten I still had her number saved. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't want to hear her voice. Not yet. Not until I was sure I wouldn't break. But she left a message. Her voice trembled. Julian, I got a notification that my tuition payment didn't go through. I don't understand. Are you okay? What's going on? I stared at the screen for a long time. Then a second call came. Talia. Her tone wasn't soft, wasn't worried. It was sharp, furious. Why haven't you paid the mortgage? She spat. I got an eviction notice. Are you trying to humiliate me? Not us. Me. That was always the point. Her image, her world, her control. I sat with the phone in my hand for 10 long minutes. I didn't call back, didn't send an essay, didn't pour out my soul. I sent one short text, one sentence, no punctuation, no warmth. I thought I never gave anything to this family. That was it. No one replied. I imagined Monica panicked, called the university, maybe cried to her advisor, maybe tried to reach Talia, who was too busy blaming me to realize that the structure she had built wasn't a home, but scaffolding. And I had simply removed the support. They always said I didn't give enough, but the truth was, I had given them everything, just not in a way that earned applause. I gave quietly, consistently, invisibly, until I didn't. And when I stopped, their foundation cracked. The silence wasn't cruel. It was clarity. And for the first time, it belonged to me. Seattle didn't welcome me with fanfare, but with silence. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones and makes you realize how loud your previous life had been. No more slamming doors, no more loaded silences at dinner, no more passive-aggressive family conversations. Just the hum of the ceiling fan, the cries of the occasional seagull, and the creak of the wooden floors that held no memory of who I was before I arrived. My new attic apartment was small but honest. A mattress on a metal frame, a table scavenged from a thrift store, and a lone armchair that leaned slightly to the left if you sat in it too long. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't curated, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was living inside someone else's expectations. I cooked simple meals for myself: eggs, rice, grilled chicken. I stopped skipping breakfast. I started running again in the mornings, when the fog clung to the sidewalks and the world still felt unwritten. And I slept. Truly slept. No tossing and turning, no waking up with a racing heart from a dream where Gerald was berating me about the coffee. My body finally had a chance to exhale. Meanwhile, their world began to unravel. Monica was the first domino to fall. Her law school didn't receive payment for the new semester, and when they contacted her, she panicked. She had never applied for financial aid. Why would she? I was her financial aid, her safety net. When that thread was cut, she floundered. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she had been suspended for non-payment, that she was trying to spin it as a mental health leave. The story changed depending on who was listening. Then there was Gerald. The man who once lectured me on discipline and legacy had his Lexus repossessed right off his manicured lawn in front of the neighbors. He had leased it in his own name, but I was the co-signer, quietly paying the bills to keep things smooth. I suppose things weren't so smooth anymore. I imagined him yelling at the tow truck driver, red-faced with fury and sputtering about family honor while the neighbors peeked from behind their blinds. And then Talia, my wife. The curator of images, the builder of facades. Her boutique crumbled within weeks of my departure. I hadn't realized how much I had propped it up until I saw the closing announcement on her Instagram, sandwiched between sponsored posts and old photos of breakfast plates. The comments were full of sympathy. Friends and influencers offered their support, prayed for its return. None of them knew that the business had been built on the quiet, steady bleed of my account. None of them knew that I was the one who paid the electricity bills, who covered the rent, who silently absorbed every shipping cost, every domain renewal, every batch of imported French wrapping paper. The calls came in waves after that. Selfish, coward, betrayer. Talia's words weren't even original. They were just a rehearsed echo of her father's. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because somewhere between the silence and the collapse, I had found someone who helped me start again. Ria. She had been my assistant back when I was juggling business meetings, family dinners, and tracking overnight deliveries for Talia's boutique. But she was more than an assistant. Ria was a quiet fire, sharp, precise, never overstepping, but always present in those moments when I didn't realize I was breaking. When I left Los Angeles, she didn't ask questions. She simply adjusted my calendar, rerouted calls, sent me listings for furnished apartments, and made sure my departure from the Barron family didn't derail my work. She never said, "I told you so," never gloated. She simply said, "Now you can rest." And I did. Ria also helped me untangle the finances. She went through every payment I had made to the Byrne family, item by item, date by date. Gerald's roof repairs, Monica's tuition bills, the boutique's expenses, even the vacation home rentals I had quietly paid for under the guise of anniversaries. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about drama, it was about clarity. We compiled a clean spreadsheet, everything labeled and documented, proof of every silent sacrifice they had never acknowledged. I didn't publish it, didn't email it, but it existed. And somehow, just knowing that made me feel like I had reclaimed something. My time, my energy, my truth. I wasn't selfish, wasn't a coward, wasn't a betrayer. I was finally free, and for the first time, I didn't need them to know it. They had always said I was a ghost in their family, barely there, never fully belonging. So when I left, it was only fitting that I haunted them with silence. No angry voicemails, no televised confessions, just absence. And in that absence, the truth bloomed like weeds in the cracks of their perfect pavement. It started quietly, whispers and texts from distant relatives. I was still technically part of Talia's extended family. Her cousin Hassan reached out privately. No pretense, no taking sides. Just 3 words. I understand. It meant more than anyone could imagine. Hassan had been at that dinner, the one where Gerald had dismissed me like a bad investment. He hadn't spoken up then, but his eyes had flickered when Gerald had barked that I had never given anything to the family. Now that the money had dried up, even the golden coins were starting to tarnish. I heard Monica started a GoFundMe, not specifically for tuition. It was artfully phrased, unexpected hardships, once stable life ruined by betrayal, help me rebuild. Her post featured a professional headshot, a gentle smile gracing her lips against a blurred backdrop of bookshelves, her hair artfully disheveled, the caption painting her as a victim of scandal rather than the architect of collapse. In 3 days, she had amassed nearly $12,000. The comments were a stream of sympathy from old classmates, online acquaintances, even a few of my distant relatives asking what had happened. Her replies were vague. Family difficulties, sudden financial betrayal, won't name names. And that was my cue. I didn't fly into a rage, didn't go live on social media, didn't type out a scathing post. I simply compiled everything Ria and I had unearthed over 2 nights of sifting through old bank statements. We cross-referenced dates with Monica's tuition bills, double-checked the expenses for the boutique's launch, and located the digital copy of the $10,000 check I'd sent to Gerald's contractor when his roof caved in. There it was, laid bare. The long trail of debts from the man who supposedly only took. Ria asked, "What are you going to do with all this?" I stared at the folder we had labeled receipts on my desktop. A digital graveyard of every dollar they pretended not to notice. "Nothing public," I said. "But if she's going to lie to strangers, she should know I'm still listening." Ria gave a small, knowing smile. Quiet justice. I like it. And I left an anonymous comment on Monica's GoFundMe post. 1 line, no name, no aggression. Ask her where the other $80,000 went. I didn't sign it, didn't attach any proof, but the effect was immediate. The comments froze, then vanished. Within hours, the campaign was private, and Monica's Instagram disappeared for the first time since she was 16. The ghost had spoken. Then the messages started. First from Monica. "Is this you? What the hell are you trying to do?" I didn't reply. "You think you're better than us now?" More silence. "You're such a coward, Julian. If you wanted to talk, you would just call." But we both knew that wasn't true. I had been trying to talk for years. I had spoken in tuition payments, in co-signed leases, in boutique startup funds. They had only learned to listen when the silence came wrapped in consequences. Talia texted next. "You didn't have to humiliate her." I replied, "Funny. No one seemed to care when I was being humiliated at dinner." She read it, didn't respond. It didn't matter anymore anyway. The truth was out. Not because I wanted to destroy them, but because I was no longer going to be erased from their narrative. I was tired of being the silent investor in a family that branded me a parasite. If they were going to rewrite the past, they would at least have to stumble over the footnotes I left behind. I kept the receipts, not for revenge, for validation, for myself. To remind myself that I hadn't been crazy, hadn't exaggerated, hadn't imagined the imbalance. It had been real, documented, archived. And every time I opened that folder, I felt less like the broken man who had walked away from that dinner, and more like someone who had finally stepped into the light. Ghosts don't need vengeance. They need acknowledgement. And after all those years of giving without return, I had finally given myself the one thing I had ever truly needed: proof that the problem wasn't me. I had just been the source. And now I was free. I hadn't planned on going back. I had told myself that chapter was closed, burned, buried beneath emails and unspoken goodbyes. But when Victor mentioned the beach house, the one I had foolishly bought in Gerald's name for tax purposes, I paused. "It's still yours," he said evenly, flipping through property documents. "Legally, your name is still on the deed. They never transferred it." Of course they didn't. Probably figured I'd keep paying for it until I died, or that I was too spineless to ask for it back. The realization didn't spark anger, just resolve, quiet, cold, clear. And I drove. Hours outside Seattle, winding along the coast. The ocean murmured a low, gray song beside me. I hadn't seen the place in almost a year. The last time Talia and I had spent a weekend there with her family, grilling steaks, drinking expensive wine, me pretending the conversations weren't landmines. This time, I didn't bring wine. I brought my lawyer's number and a quiet intention to reclaim what I had built. Before reaching the beach house, I detoured past the family estate. My name wasn't officially tied to that house, but my money lived within its walls. The new roof, the refinished floors, the updated HVAC system that had cost $11,000 after Gerald's ancient unit finally gave up the ghost. I had paid for all of it. And now, the house was slowly sliding towards foreclosure. I parked 3 houses down, pulled the key, a copy I had never returned, from my pocket. My breath fogged on the windshield as I stared at the familiar porch, now littered with fallen leaves. A crooked "for sale by owner" sign leaned against a pillar. Inside, I heard them before I saw them, likely stewing somewhere. Monica's voice cut through the hallway, quiet. Her tone was dismissive, as if she were discussing a spilled drink, not the man who had funded her entire adult life. "Don't worry about him," Gerald replied. "That boy was always weak. Thought money made him a man. Can't handle real pressure." And then, worst of all, Talia. She laughed. Not loudly, not maliciously, but easily, familiarly, as if my absence had simply created more air in the room. I stood outside, my knuckles white on the keys. I didn't go in. I left. Not out of fear, not out of sadness. I left because I realized something important. They weren't mourning me. They were rewriting me, turning me into the caricature they needed to breathe easier. And I drove to the beach house. And when I opened the door, something cracked inside me. Not pain, not nostalgia. Something lighter, something like dignity. The place was untouched. A little dusty, a little cold, but structurally sound. Like me, it smelled of cedar and sea salt, and the faint ghost of old laundry detergent. I stood in the middle of the living room and listened to the crash of the waves. No voices, no accusations, just silence. I pulled out my phone. "Victor," I said, "let's start the process of selling." "Finally ready to stop bleeding for them?" he asked. I walked to the window and watched the ocean devour the shore. "I'm ready to heal." The sale went smoothly. The house had value, and no one contested my decision. It would take a month, maybe 2. But when the deal closed, I would have more than just money. I would have closure. As I locked the door for the last time, I paused and looked at the walls. Smooth, white, with scuff marks from the beach chairs we used to drag in and out. A tiny nail hole where Talia had once hung a custom-made sign that read, "Welcome to our shore," something she had ordered off Etsy. I had never noticed before how lopsided the R in "our" was. On the drive back, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't picture their faces when they found out what I had done. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that they had said I had never given anything to their family, and I had stopped giving. And now, I was taking back what was mine, not out of revenge, out of survival. And in that simple act, One property, one transaction, one quiet reclaiming. I started to feel like a man again. Not the broken version they had left behind. Not the ghost they whispered about, but the architect of my own return. It was early morning when I sent the message. I didn't sugarcoat it or try to soften the blow. No passive phrasing, no veiled attempts at diplomacy. Just one clear sentence in the Byrne family group chat, still titled Our Inner Circle, despite how hollow that name had always felt. If I never gave anything to this family, I'm giving you what you've always wanted. Distance. Then I left the chat, just like that, finally. The moment I exited, my phone didn't vibrate. Not immediately, but I pictured it. Talia reading the message while stirring her imported coffee. Gerald sputtering in disbelief. Monica shrieking something about disrespect. I imagined their faces. I imagined them trying to scroll back, to trace their steps, to figure out which line had finally been crossed. But the truth was, they had crossed it years ago. That dinner had just been the final shove. I blocked all the numbers associated with them. Talia's, Monica's, Gerald's, even Janice, the aunt who always sided with Gerald but somehow still expected me at brunch. I even blocked a few of their friends, people who only spoke to me when they needed a small favor, as if generosity was something I carried in my wallet, ready to dispense at their whim. Victor called me later that day. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Absolutely. There will be repercussions." I know. And there were. The backlash was swifter than I anticipated. Gerald must have worked his entire contact list, trying to find someone who could reach me. I received messages from mutual business acquaintances, some polite, some insistent, trying to broker a meeting, a call, anything. I ignored them all. Talia, in desperation, started emailing me from various addresses. The subject lines grew increasingly frantic with each passing day. "Talk to me. You're ruining everything. This is who you really are." But I didn't reply, because silence wasn't cruelty. It was the most honest answer I could give. Then Monica's professors wrote to my company's general inquiry inbox. One message stood out. "Julian, we understand there may be financial circumstances surrounding Monica's recent withdrawal. If this is a misunderstanding, please let us know how we can help her return." I read it twice, then forwarded it to Ria. For the record, no response needed. She didn't ask questions. She knew what that email truly meant. They still saw me as the backup plan, the safety net, the walking ATM with a conscience. They were wrong. I hadn't cut them off out of bitterness. I wasn't punishing them. I was finally reallocating my energy. Just like I had reallocated the funds from the beach house sale. The sale had closed smoothly. Victor had wired me the final payment, and for a brief moment, I saw the sum in my account. Alluring, shimmering, years of quiet giving quantified. And then I let it go. A significant portion went to a scholarship fund for underprivileged first-generation students, kids who reminded me of myself at 19, working part-time and eating ramen 5 nights a week. I established an annual grant in my mother's name. She never finished high school, but she taught me how to survive with dignity. She deserved more than a framed photo on my shelf. Then I called a local Seattle nonprofit focused on well-being support, one Ria had recommended, a place geared towards emotional support and economic empowerment for men rebuilding their lives after divorce, betrayal, and burnout. I funded their expansion to 3 more cities. Talia eventually found out. Someone must have sent her the article when the nonprofit released information about their donors. She tweeted, of course, vaguely, about narcissists using charity to mask cruelty. Her tweet got 4 likes. I didn't respond, because this wasn't cruelty. It was correction. It was balance. They had feasted on my labor, my silence, my blind loyalty. And when the plate was empty, they had called me selfish. But they had never seen the sacrifice. They had never wanted to see it. That was the final truth I had to face. They didn't hate what I had done. They hated that I had finally done it for myself. And now, with the funds redirected, the house sold, and every emotional tendril severed, I could breathe. Not the shallow breaths of a man avoiding conflict, but deep, chest-expanding, soul-stretching breaths, the kind that come when you know you owe no one anything. I had given them distance, and in return, I had received freedom. It was an unequal exchange. It was better. The summons arrived on thick, cream-colored paper, legal, weighty, cold. I stared at it for a long time, letting the words settle. Notice of public auction. Property to be sold due to unresolved liens and financial negligence. My lien, to be precise. I had filed it weeks ago, quietly with Victor's help. It wasn't petty. It was documented, irrefutable. I had poured tens of thousands into the estate. Catching up on missed mortgage payments, critical repairs, keeping the utilities from being shut off, all things Gerald had conveniently labeled minor contributions. Except now, there was nothing minor about them. Talia had tried to stop it. She had called from an unblocked number, a new one, I gathered. Her voice was sharp, laced with desperation and disdain. "You would really put your wife out on the street?" she had said. The word wife hung in the air like smoke. Past tense would have been more accurate. She had ceased being my partner the day she had nodded at her father's lie. I hadn't replied. I had simply hung up. The court spoke louder than I ever had, and for the first time, the law was on my side. They had moved quickly, expedited the process once they reviewed my clean documentation, the signed bills, the bank statements. No family favors, just facts. The auction date was set for the following month, and yes, I went. Not out of malice, out of a need for completion. That Saturday I arrived early. The sky was heavy with clouds, gathering like a silent audience above the property that had once been ours, though I had always been merely a tenant in their kingdom. I parked down the street, walked slowly towards the house, as if it might change shape if I blinked too fast. The lawn looked parched, faded, neglected, a stark contrast to the manicured perfection it once displayed. The once pristine porch sagged slightly, the paint peeling, the railing loose. The house wasn't decaying from time, but from my absence, from the funds I had once poured into it without question. Buyers arrived in clusters. Investors, flippers, young couples lured by the prospect of a large house at a discounted price. Some carried clipboards, others whispered to their realtors, pointing out cracks in the facade like military strategists identifying weak points. And then I saw them. Gerald stood at the edge of the lawn, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the crowd with a growing panic. Talia was beside him, sunglasses obscuring her eyes, though the sun hadn't made an appearance. She clutched her phone like a weapon. Monica trailed behind them, her expression tight and drawn. They looked smaller than I remembered. Gerald spotted me. His jaw tightened. He strode towards me, fury in every step, as if this was still his house, his name, his world. "You ungrateful bastard," he hissed. "You can't do this. You think you're teaching us a lesson? You think this makes you a man?" I didn't raise my voice, didn't flinch. I simply said, "You said I never gave anything to this family. Well, I'm taking back what I paid for." His nostrils flared. Talia grabbed his arm, whispered something I couldn't hear. The auction started a few minutes later. A county representative stood on the driveway with a microphone clipped to his lapel, droning out the details of the property. The crowd edged forward. Bidding started low, hesitant, as if people were waiting for permission to pick apart the remains of someone else's empire. The price climbed steadily. 10,000 here, 5 there, then jumps of 20, 30. I didn't bid. I wasn't there to reclaim the house. I was there to witness them lose it. Victor stood beside me, quiet, unreadable. "Couple from Wisconsin," he murmured, nodding towards a young pair holding hands, their faces bright with excitement. "Looks like they're going for it." And they did. With a final offer, the gavel fell, and the house was no longer theirs. Gerald sank onto a plastic lawn chair someone had left behind. No words, just stillness. Talia didn't look at me. Monica wiped her eyes and turned away. It was over. Not just the auction, the illusion. For years, I had believed that love, real love, meant swallowing your pride, funding a world, being generous until your back broke under the weight of it all. But standing there, surrounded by buyers, strangers, and the wreckage of what I had once supported, I realized something profound. They had never wanted me. They had only wanted what I could offer. And when the offering stopped, so did their version of family. And I stood quietly at the edge of the lawn, breathing in the salt-tinged air of something final. Not revenge, reclamation. I turned to Victor and nodded. Let's go. We walked away without looking back, because some houses aren't homes, and some families aren't worth saving. The lawn had never seen so many unfamiliar cars. They lined both sides of the street, a mix of modest sedans and gleaming black SUVs. Neighbors who had once waved from behind rose bushes now lingered on their porches with coffee cups, engaging in hushed conversations, pretending not to watch. But everyone was watching. This wasn't just a foreclosure auction, it was theater, a public unraveling, the downfall of a family that had spent decades convincing everyone of their invincibility. And at the center of it all stood the house. Paint peeling, shutters askew. The porch light, once a welcoming flicker, now dead. It was a symbol now, a shell of a carefully constructed legacy, wrapped around rotting timber. I stood at the edge of the crowd, not hiding, but not pushing to the front. I wanted them to see me, not to gloat, but to witness. To understand what it had cost me to carry their image for so long, to silently pay, to bleed under their roof, and to be called selfish for finally walking away. Talia approached me before the final round of bidding. She looked different. Her usual confidence, always impeccably dressed, polished and camera-ready, was frayed at the edges. Her eyes were swollen, her mascara barely there. She wore ballet flats instead of her usual heels. It was the most human I had seen her in years. "Please don't let them sell it," she said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It just fell, hollow. "We can fix this, Julian." I tilted my head. "We?" She blinked. "You're not like this. You're not cold." I studied her. There was a time when the sound of her voice, the soft crease between her eyebrows, would have broken me. But that time was gone. "This is exactly who I am," I said quietly. "You just never noticed." She reached for my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't move towards her either. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "We can start over." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the sheer surrealism of it all. This woman, who had once sat in silence while her father dissected me over family dinners, who had watched me walk away and never followed, was now pleading for mercy. Not love. Mercy. "You nodded," I said. "That night?" She nodded. "When he told me to leave. Like you had rehearsed it. Like it made sense to you." She shook her head slowly, as if she could rewind everything. "You don't know what I felt," she said. "You're right," I said, "because you never told me." The auctioneer's voice echoed behind us, announcing the final call for bids. "Julian, please," she said again, her voice trembling now. "This house, it's everything to us." I didn't turn to face the house. I looked directly into her eyes. "You already lost everything," I said. "You just didn't realize it until the money ran out." And with that, I stepped aside. Victor moved forward, tablet in hand, confirming the sale. The couple from Wisconsin, their eyes shining with excitement, shook the auctioneer's hand, already discussing renovations and landscaping. They had no idea of the history held within those walls. Or maybe they did. Maybe they had read the neighborhood gossip, heard the whispers, but it didn't matter. The house was no longer sacred. It was property. Gerald stood by the curb, arms crossed, his cheeks flushed, as if sheer willpower could reverse the sale. He hadn't spoken to me all day, but as the crowd began to thin, he walked slowly, heavily towards me. "You think this makes you strong?" he said, his voice hoarse, weary. "Taking what isn't yours?" I looked past him at the broken window on the second floor, Monica's old room. I remembered fixing her radiator in the middle of winter when the plumber hadn't shown up. No one ever thanked me for that, ever. "This was mine," I said. "You just didn't want to admit it." He shook his head. "You've destroyed this family." I gave a small, humorless smile. "No, I just stopped funding the illusion." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in all the years I had known him, he looked small, not just old, deflated, like a balloon that had pretended to be a blimp for too long. He turned and walked away. Monica stood on the porch, arms crossed, her eyes red-rimmed, biting her lower lip. She didn't say a word, just watched. She watched me the way you watch a painting that once meant something until you realize it's just brushstrokes. The sale was final. The sales agreement was signed. The estate no longer belonged to them. I stood alone for a few minutes after everyone had left. A light breeze gently ruffled my coat. The house cast long shadows across the lawn. And for the first time, I didn't feel small standing before it. I felt equal, maybe even more. Talia had looked at me as if I were someone new, but I wasn't new. I was finally visible. She had spent years sculpting me into a safe, predictable, self-erasing version. And when that version died, they called it betrayal. But I called it resurrection. As Victor and I walked to the car, he clapped me on the shoulder. "You're free now," he said. "No," I replied, glancing back at the house behind us. I was always free. I just forgot. And this wasn't revenge. It was a reminder. I moved to Portland on a Thursday. No grand farewells, no announcements. I packed essentials into the trunk of a rented SUV, left the rest, and drove north. All I had with me was a playlist I hadn't touched in years and a silence that didn't echo, but absorbed. My new apartment was modest, a one-bedroom above a bakery that opened at 6 a.m. every morning, filling the block with the sinful scent of cinnamon and rising dough. Hardwood floors, large windows, quiet neighbors. A life that demanded no performances, no explanations. The first few weeks, I did little beyond the necessary. I worked from home, managing the back end of my consulting firm, which was still thriving, despite or perhaps because of my detachment from anything burn-related. Clients came and went, contracts renewed. Ria shouldered the bulk of the workload while I learned to breathe. No more group chats to monitor, no more phone calls to brace for, no more overdraft notifications tied to someone else's dreams. And slowly, the weight began to lift. At first, it was barely perceptible. I started waking up without that tight knot in my chest. Days went by when I didn't obsessively check my phone. My sleep deepened, my appetite returned. I began taking long walks around my neighborhood, no destination in mind, just movement. In the mornings, I journaled. Nothing profound, just small observations. How good the pastries smelled from the bakery, how the leaves danced in the wind as if they carried nothing heavier than their own shape. There was no apology in the silence, but there was peace. And then, just when I thought the past had finally quieted, the letter came. It wasn't in an envelope, just a single sheet of white paper tucked between a magazine and a flyer in my mailbox. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Narrow, slanted, and overly formal. Monica. "Julian, I understand now. I'm sorry." That was it. No signature, no explanations, no grand gesture. I stared at the note for a long time, sitting on the edge of my couch, the paper resting on my knee. My first instinct was disbelief. Was this a joke? Some manipulative tactic disguised as humility? But the handwriting didn't lie. And neither did the simplicity. She wasn't asking for money, wasn't defending herself. She was just acknowledging. For a second, I felt a familiar tug in my chest, the old reflex. The one that wanted to fix things, to reply, to meet this bare minimum of decency with a flood of generosity. But I didn't move. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't type out a response. Instead, I carefully folded the note, tucked it into the back of my journal, and closed the cover. I didn't need to frame it, and I certainly didn't need to frame her forgiveness. I understood then that forgiveness wasn't about rebuilding a bridge. It was about no longer standing on the edge, staring at the planks, wondering why you were the only one carrying nails. It was about saying enough and meaning it. It was about finding peace, not in reconciliation, but in restraint. I didn't hate Monica. I didn't even hate Gerald. Hate implied there was still an emotional tether, something left to burn. What I felt was distance, and that distance, for the first time, felt sacred. That weekend, I went for a hike. A trail just outside the city. Not challenging, but steep enough to make my legs ache the next day. At the summit was a clearing that overlooked the valley, green, quiet, and filled with a stillness I had forgotten cities could offer. I sat on a rock and thought about everything. The money, the dinners, the boutique invoices, the unacknowledged sacrifices, the silence that was always expected of me, but never offered in return. And then I thought about the small things that had replaced it all. The pastry I now bought every Friday morning. The elderly woman who nodded at me by the mailbox, as if we had been neighbors for years. The way I no longer rehearsed arguments in the shower. This was life now. Not rebuilt, but rediscovered. Back in my apartment, I lit a candle. Not for ritual, but simply because I wanted the place to smell like something warm. I made tea, opened a book, put on the playlist without the emotional landmines. I didn't check my phone once. Not because I was ignoring anyone, but because for the first time in years, no one held dominion over the silence. And that was freedom. I hadn't arrived here through vengeance or retribution. I had arrived here by consciously choosing myself every day. And now, even when the past knocked on my door, it found only a man who no longer answered its call. It rained the night I finally allowed myself to just sit still and be. Not work, not rebuild, not prove anything. I made a cup of hot tea. Nothing fancy, just black with a slice of lemon, and stepped onto the balcony of my Portland apartment. The mist hung in the air like breath caught in time, clinging to the railings, softening the distant rooftops until they began to shimmer. It wasn't a storm, just a quiet rain. The kind that doesn't shout or tear at trees, but lingers, present, persistent, like a memory. I sat, one hand cradling the mug, the other tucked into the pocket of my hoodie. Below, the city made the occasional sound of tires swishing through puddles, a dog barking in the distance. The bakery was closed for the night, its sign still glowing faintly on the sidewalk. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for closure, for an apology, for someone else to define who I was. My thoughts drifted back to that dinner, the long oak table, Gerald's voice like a hammer blow separating truth from fiction. You only take. You've never given anything to this family. I hadn't known it then, but that moment would cleave my life in two, before the nod, after the silence. Talia's face surfaced in my memory. Not angry, not sad, just absent. That empty expression as she sat beside him, her body still and unreadable, as if she had already decided I was a burden she no longer needed to carry. Maybe she had been right. Or maybe she had never seen me at all. I had given everything. Time, energy, money, loyalty. Not because I needed control, but because I believed in building a life together. I believed love was the foundation, not the decoration. That support wasn't weakness, and sacrifice wasn't currency to be spent for gratitude. It was just what you did when you cared. But somewhere along the way, They had convinced me that what I gave wasn't real, wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough. And I had bled silently until the bleeding stopped. And when I left, they hadn't mourned the man. They had mourned the loss of his utility. That realization had been brutal, but it had also been freeing. Because when everything crumbled, when the tuition payment stopped, the cars disappeared, and the lights went out, only then did they see that I had been holding it all up. Not because I wanted them to fall, but because I needed to stop falling myself. They had called me selfish, but never asked what it cost to constantly give without being seen. They had called me heartless, but never asked how many nights I had lain awake trying to keep them afloat. They had called me a betrayer, but had never offered loyalty in return. In their minds, I had been the problem, the weak link, the ghost. The outsider who never quite earned a place at the table, even after I had bought the chairs, cooked the food, and paid for the roof over it all. But here's the thing about ghosts. We don't haunt the living. We remind them of what they buried. And they had buried me piece by piece, smile by smile, invoice by invoice, until the man standing there at that dinner was no longer me. Just a shell of who I had once been, desperately trying to prove his worth to people who had already decided he had none. But now I was the man they had tried to break and failed. Not because I had fought harder, but because I had stopped fighting for them and started fighting for myself. I hadn't burned their house down. I had just taken back the kindling. I hadn't destroyed a family. I had just stopped pretending we were one, and when the silence came, when the money ran out, when the favors ceased, they had crumbled. Not because I had ruined them, but because, without what I gave, they had never been whole. I hadn't been their family. I had been their foundation, and once I walked away, they had to learn how to walk without a floor beneath their feet. That wasn't cruelty, that was consequence. The tea in my hand had gone cold, but I didn't move. I watched the mist thicken, the night deepen, the city lights blur behind the wet glass. My reflection stared back, not with regret, but with recognition. This was the man they had tried to erase. This was the man they had tried to diminish. This was the man who had walked away, and this was the man who had finally come home, to himself. The rain intensified. I sat still and let it wash over me.